There's something about the void that makes you feel invincible, until it doesn't. Out here, light years away from the comforting pull of Earth's gravity, the universe has a way of reminding you just how small you are. My name is Captain Elias Rogers. I've logged 15 years aboard the flagship vessels of the United Federation of Planets. I've seen dying stars devour entire systems. I've witnessed cosmic storms that would turn most men's blood cold. I've even met alien civilizations who, until then, had only existed in our wildest imaginations. But none of it compares to what happened aboard the Odyssey 7. Nothing comes close. When you spend enough time in the black, you learn to trust your gut. It starts as a quiet whisper, a nagging itch at the back of your mind that you can't quite scratch. This time, it screamed at me from the moment we entered the Theta 7 nebula. We weren't supposed to find anything. At least, that's what the Federation brief said. Theta 7 was just another anomaly, an unremarkable blip on the star charts. But someone somewhere had flagged unusual energy readings emanating from the nebula, and it was our job to figure out why. I should have known better. Every captain's strength is their crew, and mine were the best I could have asked for. On my left was Lieutenant Jonathan Blake. He was the kind of man who could break the tension of a nuclear standoff with a well-timed joke. He wasn't just my second in command, he was my brother in arms. We'd fought side by side during the siege of Vega 9, and if there was anyone I trusted to have my back, it was Blake. Then there was Dr. Amelia Grant, our lead astrobiologist. Where Blake was the hammer, she was the scalpel. Cool, precise, and endlessly curious. She could look at a microscopic spore and unravel the secrets of its evolution in seconds. Amelia was the reason we'd been assigned to this mission. Her groundbreaking work on non-carbon-based life forms had turned heads all across the Federation. Together, we were unstoppable, or so we thought. It started on day 7. The Odyssey 7 had just entered the outer edges of the nebula. The ship's sensors began to pick up something unusual. A mass, roughly the size of a small moon, floating in the void. "Captain, you're gonna want to see this," Blake said, his voice crackling through the intercom. I made my way to the observation deck, where Amelia and Blake stood staring at the display. The object was unsettling. It was jet black, absorbing every photon of light that dared to touch it. Its surface writhed and pulsed, like a living thing trapped in an endless, agonizing loop. "It's organic," Amelia said, her voice tinged with awe and unease. "But it's not like anything we've seen before." Blake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So, what are we looking at? A giant space jellyfish? A cosmic blob?" "I don't think it's alive," Amelia replied. "At least, not in the way we understand life. It's reactive." Reactive. That word should have been our first clue to leave it the hell alone. Instead, curiosity got the better of us. We deployed the ship's mechanical arms to take a sample. As the claw extended toward the object, the black mass seemed to ripple, almost like it was watching us. Cap? You seeing this?" Blake muttered. "I see it," I said, my gut twisting. "Stay on your toes." The arm made contact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the mass quivered violently and latched onto the claw. Alarms blared across the ship as the mass began to crawl up the arm like liquid metal. "Retract it. Now," I shouted. Blake slammed his hand on the controls, but it was too late. The sample container detached and sealed itself, but not before the arm was completely consumed. The black mass slithered back into the void, leaving behind an eerie silence. "We got the sample," Amelia said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "And a whole lot of bad vibes," Blake added back in the lab. Amelia studied the sample with an intensity one hadn't seen in her before. It was contained in a reinforced stasis chamber, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "It's feeding," she said. "On what?" I asked. "Energy," she replied, pointing to the monitor. "It's siphoning power directly from the containment field." "That's impossible," Blake interjected. "That field's designed to hold antimatter." "Well, tell that to the blob," Amelia shot back. The tension in the room was palpable. I ordered Amelia to prepare the sample for ejection, but before she could, the ship shuddered violently. Lights flickered, and a deep, guttural hum filled the corridors. "What the hell was that?" I barked. Blake's voice came over the intercom, strained and panicked. "Cap, the mass, it's spreading." Within hours, the black mass had infiltrated the ship's systems. It moved like a virus, consuming everything in its path. We tried to contain it, but it adapted too quickly. It wasn't just feeding on the ship, it was learning. Blake was the first to go. He'd stayed behind in engineering to buy us time to seal off the affected sections. I'll never forget his last words. "Rogers, you better get your ass out of here. Don't let this thing win." Amelia and I retreated to the bridge, but the mass was relentless. It broke through bulkheads, flooding the room with its inky tendrils. Amelia shoved me into the escape pod, sealing the hatch behind me. "You're the captain," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Get back to Earth. Warn them." "Amelia, no." I tried to protest, but the pod ejected before I could finish. Through the small viewport, I saw the Odyssey 7 consumed by darkness. And then nothing. When I finally landed on Earth, I was met with disbelief. The Federation dismissed my warnings, attributing the events to a containment failure. They wouldn't listen. But I know what I saw. Out there, in the cold, unfeeling void, something watches. Something waits. And it's only a matter of time before it finds us again. Space has a way of turning seconds into eternity. After the events of Theta 7, I've come to believe that time moves differently in the black. It warps and bends, stretches and shrinks, depending on your proximity to life or death. Out there, surrounded by the infinite void, it's impossible not to feel the pull of the unknown and the danger it hides. The Odyssey 7 was designed for deep space exploration, equipped with state-of-the-art technology and the brightest minds humanity had to offer. But no amount of preparation could have braced us for what we were about to face. In hindsight, perhaps the nebula had been our warning, its swirling mists and jagged electromagnetic fields screaming to be left undisturbed. "We didn't listen, Captain. We're approaching the outer edge of the nebula," said Blake from his station. His voice carried a mix of excitement and unease that mirrored my own. "Steady as she goes, Lieutenant," I replied, my eyes locked on the swirling blue and violet storm that filled the main view screen. Theta 7 wasn't just a nebula, it was a vortex of raw energy, its chaotic beauty a stark reminder of the universe's untamed power. Amelia stood beside me, a tablet clutched tightly in her hands. She had been poring over data for hours, analyzing the strange energy signatures we'd picked up on approach. "Captain, these readings are unlike anything we've encountered before. There's a frequency embedded in the signal, almost like a pattern." "A pattern?" Blake asked, swiveling his chair to face her. "You mean like a message?" "Possibly," Amelia replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Or it could be natural, some kind of cosmic phenomenon we haven't classified yet." I leaned forward in my chair, my instincts prickling. "Natural or not, we proceed with caution. I don't want any surprises." Blake chuckled, though there was little humor in his voice. "Cap, surprises are the whole point of this job." As we pushed deeper into the nebula, the Odyssey 7 began to register fluctuations in its systems. Minor power surges, static interference in the comms. Nothing unusual for a mission of this magnitude, but enough to put us all on edge. "Captain," said Amelia, breaking the tense silence, "I think we've found something." The room seemed to hold its breath as she transferred her findings to the main display. There, amidst the chaos of Theta 7, was a void, a perfect sphere of blackness, darker than anything I'd ever seen. It didn't reflect light. It didn't absorb it. It simply was. "What the hell is that?" Blake muttered, his usual bravado replaced by genuine unease. "Some kind of gravitational anomaly?" I suggested, though I didn't believe my own words. Amelia shook her head. "No. There's no distortion around it. Whatever this is, it's stable." Stable. That word sent a chill down my spine. Stable meant intentional. Stable meant it didn't belong here. "Prepare the mechanical arms," I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're taking a closer look." Blake hesitated. "Captain, you sure about this? That thing doesn't exactly scream harmless." "I'm aware, Lieutenant," I said. "But this is why we're here. Amelia, coordinate the extraction." The tension in the room was palpable as the Odyssey 7 crept closer to the black sphere. On my command, the ship's mechanical arm extended, its claw inching toward the void like a curious hand reaching into the dark. "Captain," Amelia said, her voice tight, "the object is reacting." On the screen, the black mass rippled, its surface shifting like liquid glass. The claw made contact, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, the mass seemed to reach out. It wasn't a physical movement, but a shift in presence, a feeling that something was looking back at us. "Retract the arm," I ordered, my gut screaming that we'd made a mistake. Before Blake could comply, the mass latched onto the claw. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring as the mass began to spread, creeping up the mechanical arm like a predatory vine. "We've got a breach," shouted Blake. It's in the containment system. Seal it off. I barked, my heart pounding. Amelia, status report. I'm trying, she yelled, her fingers flying across the console. The containment field isn't holding. It's... Her words were cut off by a deafening roar as the ship's lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. When the emergency lighting kicked in, the black mass was gone, retracted back into the void as if it had never been there. But it had left something behind, that I in the lab. Amelia worked furiously to analyze the sample we'd managed to capture. It was contained in a reinforced stasis chamber, its writhing form pulsating with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat. It's alive, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. Or something close to it. Blake peered over her shoulder, his usual bravado returning in the form of a nervous grin. Great. We've officially pissed off the universe. Captain, Amelia said, ignoring him, this entity is absorbing energy. The containment field is the only thing keeping it in check, but it's draining power at an alarming rate. How much time do we have? I asked. Hours, maybe less, she replied. We need to eject it. Blake nodded. Finally, something we agree on. Let's chuck it back into the void and pretend this never happened. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to get rid of it, but something about the mass nagged at me, an inexplicable pull, like it wanted to be understood. Amelia, can we learn anything from it? Possibly, she said. But the risk? The ship shuddered again, cutting her off. This time, the tremor was followed by a low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. What now? Blake muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Amelia's face went pale as she checked the monitors. Captain, it's spreading. The black mass had infiltrated the ship's systems, moving like a virus through the circuits and conduits. Lights flickered, comms crackled, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just feeding on energy, it was learning, adapting, becoming something more. Evacuate the lower decks, I ordered, my voice barely masking my rising panic. Blake, seal off engineering. Amelia, focus on containment. What about you? Blake asked. I'm heading to the bridge, I said. If we can't stop this thing, we're ejecting it, and the lab with it. As I ran through the corridors, the mass seemed to follow, its inky tendrils creeping along the walls. I could hear its pulse, a deep, rhythmic thrum that matched the beating of my heart. It was alive, and it was hunting us. By the time I reached the bridge, the ship was barely holding together. The mass had consumed entire sections, and the cries of my crew echoed through the comms before being abruptly silenced. I was alone, or so I thought. The black mass was waiting for me, coiled in the shadows like a predator preparing to strike. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it spoke. Rogers, there's a moment in every disaster where you realize you've lost control. It's not sudden, it creeps in slowly, like the spread of frost on a window pane. For me, that moment came as I stood on the bridge of the Odyssey 7, staring into the writhing blackness that had invaded my ship. Rogers, the sound, or whatever it was, slithered through my mind like a cold, oily tendril. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense. It didn't come through the comms or echo off the walls. It bypassed all that, embedding itself directly into my thoughts. I staggered back, gripping the console for support. The black mass pulsed faintly at the edges of the room, its shifting form almost hypnotic. Captain, come in. Blake's voice crackled through the intercom, jolting me out of my daze. What the hell is happening up there? I hit the comm switch with a trembling hand. It had spoke. Blake didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was tight. Spoke? Cap, are you sure about that? I glanced at the mass again, its dark tendrils slowly retracting into the vents like a predator retreating to the shadows. I'm not sure of anything anymore. Down in the lab, Amelia was fighting her own battle. The sample we'd taken, if it could still be called that, was no longer confined to the containment chamber. The reinforced walls of the stasis unit had fractured, black tendrils snaking out like the roots of some malevolent plant. Captain, Amelia's voice came through the comms, strained and breathless. The sample, it's replicating. I cursed under my breath. How bad? Bad, she said. It's growing exponentially. If it breaches the lab, we won't be able to contain it. Then don't let it breach, I snapped, though I knew how futile the order sounded. Blake, get to the lab and assist her. On it, Blake replied, though his voice carried a weight of uncertainty I wasn't used to hearing. As they worked to contain the growing threat, I turned my attention to the ship's systems. The Odyssey 7 was bleeding power, the mass siphoning energy from every available source. Life support, navigation, propulsion. Everything was failing. One system at a time, Blake arrived at the lab, just as the containment field gave out completely. The black mass erupted from the stasis chamber in a violent surge, flooding the room with its inky tendrils. Amelia barely had time to react, diving behind a console as the mass engulfed the equipment. "Blake, get out of there!" I shouted through the comms, my heart pounding. "No chance, Cap," Blake replied, his voice tinged with grim determination. "I've got this." He activated the emergency purge system, flooding the lab with a burst of ionized plasma. The mass shrieked, an ear-piercing, otherworldly sound that reverberated through the ship. For a moment, it seemed to retreat, its tendrils pulling back into the walls. Blake turned to Amelia, a triumphant grin on his face. "See? Piece of." The mass struck like a serpent, a tendril lashing out and wrapping around his torso. Blake's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror. "Blake!" Amelia screamed, scrambling toward him. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice strained as the tendril tightened. "Go, Amelia. That's an order." Amelia hesitated, torn between obeying and trying to save him. But the mass wasn't waiting for her to decide. It dragged Blake toward the heart of the lab, his screams echoing through the comms before being abruptly cut off. I slammed my fist against the console, my vision blurred by rage and grief. Blake was gone, taken by the very thing we'd sought to understand. I wanted to scream, to curse the universe for its cruelty, but there was no time for that. The mass wasn't finished. "Amelia," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Are you safe?" A moment of silence passed before she responded, her voice shaking. I made it out. "Captain, we need to abandon ship." "No," I said firmly. "Not yet. We can still eject the lab." "Ejecting the lab won't stop this thing," she argued. "It's already spread too far." She was right, of course. The mass wasn't just confined to the lab anymore. It was in the walls, the conduits, the very lifeblood of the ship. But I couldn't bring myself to give the order to abandon ship. Not yet. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The ship was silent now, save for the occasional groan of metal under stress. I found Amelia in the med bay, patching up a cut on her arm. She looked up as I entered, her expression one of exhaustion and despair. "Captain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been analyzing the data we collected before the lab was compromised. I think this thing is intelligent." I frowned. "Intelligent? How?" She pulled up a display, showing a series of complex patterns that had been recorded from the mass's movements. "These aren't random. They're coordinated. It's adapting, learning. It's not just a parasite, it's a predator." A cold chill ran down my spine. "And we're its prey." With the ship deteriorating and the mass growing stronger by the minute, I knew we were out of options. I called Amelia to the bridge and laid out a desperate plan. "We eject the core," I said. "If the mass is feeding on our energy, we cut off its supply." Amelia's eyes widened. "Ejecting the core will destroy the ship." "I know," I replied, "but it might buy us enough time to escape." She hesitated, then nodded. "What about you?" "I'll handle the core. You get to the escape pod." "Captain, no. That's an order, Amelia," I said firmly. "I'm not losing anyone else." As I made my way to engineering, the ship groaned under the strain of the mass's weight. Its tendrils were everywhere now, coiling through the corridors like living shadows. My every step was a battle, each corner a potential ambush. When I reached the core, I began the ejection sequence, my hands shaking as I entered the override codes. The mass seemed to sense what I was doing. It surged toward me, its tendrils lashing out like whips. "Not today," I muttered, activating the final sequence. The core detached, its fiery glow illuminating the darkness as it was jettisoned into the void. The mass screamed, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. That I stumbled into the escape pod, barely managing to seal the hatch as the ship began to disintegrate. Through the viewport, I saw the Odyssey 7 consumed by fire and darkness, the mass writhing in agony as it was torn apart. But as the pod drifted away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The mass wasn't dead. It was merely waiting. The void is a strange kind of silence. It presses against you, fills your ears, and wraps around your thoughts like an iron vice. When I escaped the Odyssey 7, the silence was my only companion. It wasn't comforting, it was suffocating, like the darkness was mourning with me. I was floating in the escape pod, watching the remnants of my ship drift into the abyss. The explosion of the core had torn apart the Odyssey 7, taking most of the black mass with it, or so I hoped. Sparks of light scattered like distant fireworks, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like retreat. Blake, Amelia, their names escaped my lips before I realized I'd spoken aloud. My chest tightened, the weight of their loss bearing down on me. I had failed them, failed to protect my crew, my friends. All I could do now was survive. For them, the pod systems buzzed to life, breaking the eerie silence. A holographic display lit up, showing my position relative to the Federation outpost nearest to the nebula. The NAV system estimated I had a 2-week journey ahead of me, assuming the pod's limited supplies of oxygen and energy held out. Great, I muttered, leaning back in the seat. 2 weeks alone with nothing but my thoughts and the blackness beyond the window. The pod's AI chirped, its monotone voice filling the cabin. Warning, pod functionality at 74%. Long-range communications offline. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course the comms were down. The black mass had likely fried the system before I even ejected. The only thing I could do was wait, and hope the first few days passed without incident. I rationed my food and water, using every spare moment to review the logs I'd managed to salvage. Amelia's research, Blake's system updates, even my own captain's logs, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. What was the black mass? Where had it come from? And why had it spoken to me? These questions circled in my mind like vultures, gnawing at my sanity. I tried to focus on the data, hoping for answers, but the logs only deepened the mystery. Amelia's scans had revealed something chilling, an energy signature within the mass that matched no known source. It was as if the mass wasn't just alive but ancient, predating the stars themselves. On the 5th day I saw it again. I was staring out the viewport, lost in thought, when I noticed a flicker of movement. At first, I dismissed it as debris from the Odyssey 7, but then it moved, deliberately unnaturally. A tendril of blackness slithered past the window, disappearing into the void. "No," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "That's impossible." But it wasn't. The black mass hadn't been destroyed. It had survived, and now it was hunting me. Over the next few days, the pod began to fail. Systems that had been stable before now flickered and stuttered, as if something was interfering with them. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer. I felt its presence before I saw it, a weight pressing down on my chest, a whisper at the edges of my mind. "Rogers." The word sent shivers down my spine. It was the same voice, the same dark, invasive presence I'd felt aboard the Odyssey 7. The black mass wasn't just a predator, it was intelligent. And it wanted me to know it was still there. I tried to ignore it, focusing on survival. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just sounds, they were memories. Blake's laughter, Amelia's determined voice, even the hum of the Odyssey VII's engines. It was as if the mass was pulling pieces of my mind apart, reshaping them into its own language. "Leave me alone," I shouted, slamming my fist against the console. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence returned. Then the viewport darkened, and I saw it, the black mass, coiled around the pod like a serpent. Its tendrils pressed against the glass, pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly light that I scrambled to the control panel, searching for anything I could use to fight back. The pod systems were limited, but I had one advantage, the emergency thrusters. If I could generate enough heat and energy, maybe I could force the mass to retreat. "Come on," I muttered, my hands flying over the controls. "Work with me here." The pod shuddered as the thrusters roared to life, spewing jets of plasma into the void. The black mass recoiled, its tendrils writhing as the heat burned through it. But it didn't retreat, it adapted. The tendrils shifted, wrapping around the thrusters and snuffing them out. "Damn it!" I cursed, slamming my hand against the console. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the cabin with an overwhelming sense of dread. I grabbed the emergency toolkit and pulled out a flare gun. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Taking a deep breath, I aimed at the viewport and fired. The flare burst into brilliant light, illuminating the cabin and the mass beyond. For a brief moment, I saw it in its entirety, a sprawling, pulsating nightmare of darkness and energy. The mass screeched, its tendrils retreating from the light. I fired again and again, driving it back until it finally let go of the pod. The silence returned, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. On the 10th day, I discovered something strange in the pod's logs. Buried deep in the system was a signal, one I hadn't noticed before. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A series of pulses and patterns, similar to the ones Amelia had detected in Theta 7. The signal wasn't random. It was deliberate, and it was coming from the black mass. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The mass wasn't just hunting me, it was communicating. But why? What did it want? I began to decode the signal, piecing together its patterns and rhythms. At first, it seemed like nonsense, a jumble of data with no clear meaning. But as the hours passed, a message began to emerge, simple, chilling, undeniable. We are here. The words burned into my mind, a declaration and a warning. The black mass wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of something larger, something far beyond my comprehension. And it was watching. As the pod drifted closer to the Federation outpost, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The mass had let me go for now. But it wasn't finished. It was just the beginning. I've always believed that silence in space is both a blessing and a curse. Out there, amidst the emptiness, the absence of sound can calm your nerves, until it doesn't. Drifting alone in the escape pod, I felt that silence again. But this time, it wasn't the quiet of the cosmos. It was the calm before a storm I couldn't yet see. The signal from the black mass haunted me. We are here. Those 3 words had burned themselves into my thoughts, repeating endlessly like a broken record. They weren't a warning, they were a declaration. The entity wasn't simply reacting to us. It was announcing itself to me, perhaps to humanity. By the 12th day, the pod's navigation system had locked onto the Federation outpost. It was a lonely beacon of light in the vast expanse, orbiting a desolate planet on the fringes of known space. As I approached, I opened a channel, hoping the comm systems were functional enough to send a message. "This is Captain Elias Rogers of the Odyssey 7, I said, my voice raw from days of screaming into the void. "Requesting immediate assistance." "Do you copy?" Static crackled through the speakers before a familiar voice broke through. "Captain Rogers? This is Commander Patel at Outpost Epsilon. We've been trying to reach you for days. What happened out there?" I hesitated, the weight of my story threatening to crush me. How could I explain what had happened, what was still happening, without sounding insane? "Prepare for quarantine," I said finally. "You're going to want to isolate this pod the moment I dock." There was a pause. "Understood, Captain. We'll be ready." The docking process was automated, the pod guided into a sterile hangar bay by robotic arms. I watched through the viewport as a team of hazmat-clad engineers approached the pod, their movements precise and methodical. The decontamination protocols were strict, as they should be. If even a fragment of the black mass had followed me, the entire station could be at risk. When the hatch finally opened, I was greeted by Commander Patel, a sharp-eyed woman whose expression shifted from relief to concern as she took in my appearance. "You look like hell, Captain," she said, her tone devoid of judgment. "You have no idea," I replied, stepping onto the platform. My legs wobbled, and used to gravity after weeks in micro-G, but I steadied myself against the railing. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" She nodded, leading me through a series of airlocks and corridors until we reached a small conference room. The hum of the station's life support systems was a welcome change from the oppressive silence of the pod. "All right, Captain," Patel said, folding her arms. "What the hell happened out there?" I told her everything, about the Theta 7 Nebula, the Black Mass, Blake's sacrifice, Amelia's final act of courage. I spared no detail, even describing the whispers and the message it had left me with. Throughout my account, Patel remained silent, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "That's a lot to take in. You think I'm lying," I said flatly. "No," she replied, surprising me. "But you have to admit, it sounds insane." "It is insane," I shot back. "But it's the truth. That thing out there, it's intelligent. And it's not alone." Patel frowned, her gaze drifting to the monitor on the wall. "We've been picking up strange readings in the nebula ever since the Odyssey 7 disappeared. Energy spikes, signal disruptions. We thought it was just interference, but now you know it's something worse," I finished for her. She nodded. "If this is true, the Federation needs to know. But there's a problem." "Of course there is," I muttered. "What now?" Patel hesitated before answering. "The signal you described, the 'we are here,' it's spreading." Before I could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. Patel's communicator crackled to life, a panicked voice shouting over the noise. "Commander, we've got an anomaly approaching the station." Patel and I rushed to the control room, where the crew was scrambling to make sense of the readings on their screens. On the main display, I saw it, a shadow moving through the nebula, its form shifting and undulating like smoke and water. "It's the mass," I said, my stomach sinking. "It followed me. Impossible, Patel said, though her voice lacked conviction. The pod was clean. We scanned it. It doesn't need to hitch a ride, I interrupted. It's drawn to us. To me. The black mass emerged from the nebula, coiling around the station like a constrictor. Its tendrils pressed against the hull, probing for weaknesses. The lights flickered, and the hum of the station's systems turned into an ominous drone. Get your people out of here, I said, turning to Patel. Now, what about you? She asked. I'll buy you time. Patel hesitated but nodded, barking orders to her crew. As the station's personnel evacuated to escape pods, I stayed behind in the control room, my mind racing for a plan. The station had one advantage over the Odyssey 7, weaponry. Its plasma turrets were designed for asteroid defense, but could be repurposed for something more creative. I activated the manual controls, targeting the mass as it slithered along the hull. Come on, you bastard, I muttered, my finger hovering over the trigger. The first volley of plasma lit up the void, striking the mass with enough force to tear apart a small moon. It recoiled, shrieking in that same bone-chilling tone I'd heard before. But it didn't retreat. It adapted, splitting into smaller tendrils that darted toward the turrets. Captain, we've got a breach. Patel's voice came over the comms. The mass is inside. I left the control room, following the screams and chaos that echoed through the station's corridors. The black mass was everywhere now, its tendrils weaving through the walls like veins. As I approached the heart of the station, I saw something that stopped me cold. Amelia. She stood at the center of the mass, her body enveloped in its dark tendrils. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her expression eerily calm. Amelia? I whispered, my voice trembling. Captain, she said, though her voice wasn't hers. It was layered, alien. You should not have returned. What are you? I demanded. We are the shadow of the first, she replied. The memory of creation. I didn't understand her words, but I didn't need to. The mass wasn't just a predator. It was something far older, far more dangerous. And now it had Amelia. The tendrils began to close in around me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave her. Even as the mass whispered my name, even as the station groaned under its weight, I couldn't abandon her again. Rogers, she said, her voice almost tender. Run. And then the lights went out. The world turned to black, and in that moment, I felt the weight of the void pressing down on me, heavier than ever before. The whispers came back, louder, clearer, filling my mind with a chorus of voices that weren't mine. We are here. We have always been here. Amelia, I screamed, my voice raw. Fight it. You can fight it. But the figure standing in the mass, her form half submerged in its darkness, didn't react. Her glowing eyes turned toward me, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something, recognition, pain, maybe even resistance. Then the mass pulsed, and that glimmer vanished. The tendrils lashed out, forcing me to dive behind a broken console. Sparks flew, the acrid scent of burning circuitry filling the air. The station groaned, its structure buckling under the sheer weight of the entity. I knew I didn't have much time, that I scrambled through the wreckage, my mind racing for a plan. The station's power core was my only chance. Like the Odyssey 7, the core housed enough energy to obliterate everything within a 100-kilometer radius. If I could overload it, I might be able to destroy the black mass for good. But the thought of leaving Amelia behind. I clenched my fists, forcing the guilt aside. Amelia had made her choice. Now it was my turn to honor it. The core was located in the deepest part of the station, a labyrinth of narrow corridors and service tunnels. As I made my way down, the mass followed. Its tendrils slithered along the walls, dripping with a viscous, black substance that seemed to defy gravity. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Rogers, join us. I ignored them, pushing forward even as the air grew thick and oppressive. My every breath was a struggle, my lungs burning with the effort. The mass wasn't just chasing me, it was poisoning the station, turning its environment against me. When I finally reached the core chamber, I felt a flicker of hope. The glowing sphere of energy hummed with power, its containment field flickering as the mass tried to breach it. I hurried to the control panel, my hands shaking as I activated the manual override. Warning, core overload initiated. Evacuate immediately. The automated voice was cold, emotionless, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around me. I set the timer for 10 minutes, just enough time to get to the escape pods. Assuming, of course, that the mass didn't catch me first, as I turned to leave, the mass surged into the chamber, blocking my path. At its center stood Amelia, or what was left of her. Her body was encased in the black substance, her features distorted but still recognizable. "You cannot win, Rogers," she said, her voice a haunting mix of her own and the entity's. "We are beyond you." I tightened my grip on the flare gun, the only weapon I had left. "Amelia, if you're still in there, you need to fight this." "There is no Amelia," she replied, taking a step forward. "Only us." The tendrils lunged toward me, and I fired. The flare struck her square in the chest, erupting in a burst of light and heat. The mass recoiled, shrieking as it writhed in agony. For a brief moment, I saw her, really saw her. Her eyes met mine, filled with desperation. "Go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Before it's too late." I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, the sound of her screams chasing me through the corridors. The station was falling apart, pieces of its structure tearing away as the core's energy built to critical levels. I reached the escape pod bay just as the timer hit 2 minutes. The pod's hatch opened with a hiss, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Through the viewport, I saw the black mass surging toward me, its tendrils reaching out like claws. The pod's engines roared to life, and I felt the familiar jolt as it launched into the void. I watched as the station shrank in the distance, its lights flickering before disappearing entirely. Then, with a blinding flash, the core detonated. The shockwave rippled outward, consuming everything in its path. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But the mass didn't die. It lingered at the edge of the explosion, its form shifting and writhing, as if mocking me. When the pod's system stabilized, I activated the distress beacon and leaned back in the seat, exhaustion washing over me. My body ached, my mind was frayed, and my heart felt like it had been ripped apart. But I was alive. For now. The Federation rescue team found me 3 days later. They didn't ask many questions, probably because they knew they wouldn't like the answers. I was debriefed, my story recorded, and then dismissed. The official report labeled the incident as an unforeseen containment failure. No mention of the black mass, no acknowledgement of the lives lost. I was sent back to Earth, but I didn't feel like I'd returned home. The whispers still haunted me, even in my dreams. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw Amelia's face, her final words echoing in my mind months later. While sitting in the solitude of my apartment, I received a transmission. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A series of pulses and patterns, identical to the ones we'd detected in Theta 7. "We are here."